The first billion-dollar company was owned by J.P. Morgan, who possessed wealth, power, and influence. He dominated the country's most profitable industries, and on multiple occasions, the economy of the United States literally depended on his actions. With a simple word or the stroke of a pen, he could either save a company from collapse or doom it to bankruptcy. While he was hated by some, others admired him, acknowledging that there would never be another man quite like J.P. Morgan. This is the story of his life. Born into privileged circumstances in Connecticut in 1837, John Pierpont Morgan's father, Junior Spencer Morgan, was already a wealthy banker who ensured that John received the best education money could buy. The goal was to groom John to follow in his father's footsteps as a financier. Despite being born into wealth, John's childhood was bleak due to various medical conditions. He was a sickly child, regularly suffering from brutal coughing fits, migraines, seizures, and diseases like scarlet fever. His ailments often prevented him from playing outside with other kids, leading him to spend his time indoors studying and reading financial statements. At one point, rheumatic fever incapacitated him, and his father's solution was to send him to live alone on the Azores Islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The hope was that the climate and salty air would aid his recovery, and John remained on the island for nearly a year without any family. Once he was well enough, he continued his education. By 1857, at the age of 19, John had completed his studies in Boston, Switzerland, and Germany and was ready to enter the workforce. Thanks to his father's position as a junior partner at the London-based merchant banking firm George Peabody & Company, John secured a job on Wall Street in the banking firm responsible for overseeing Peabody's interests in America. As part of his job, he wrote reports to his father's firm, detailing financial and political developments in the country. America, which was still an emerging market at that time, posed challenges for John due to his perceived rash and hot-tempered nature. His father worried that he needed to learn restraint and responsibility to become a successful financier. One instance of recklessness occurred in 1859 when John used company money to purchase an entire shipment of Brazilian coffee without a buyer in New Orleans. Though he made a profit upon selling it, senior members of the banking house, including John Farber, disapproved of such risk-taking. In 1861, at the age of 24, John decided to leave the safety and security of an established firm and establish his own company, acting as an agent for his father's bank in England. It was also the year he married his first love, Amelia Sturgis, but their happiness was short-lived. Amelia's persistent cough, later diagnosed as tuberculosis, led John to take her on an extended honeymoon in the Mediterranean, hoping for her recovery. Sadly, Amelia passed away just 4 months after their wedding, leaving John heartbroken and deeply affected by the tragic loss. During this time, the United States was facing its own crisis. The American Civil War had broken out. In 1863, the Conscription Act should have required John to enlist, but he paid $300 to avoid service and have a substitute take his place. Despite not directly participating in the war, he profited immensely from it. For instance, he financed the purchase of 5,000 surplus Hall carbine rifles from the government at $3.50 each, which were then resold to the government for $22 each after minor adjustments, yielding substantial profits. However, such war profiteering actions were not well received by the public or the government, leading to controversies surrounding John. Despite the challenges and controversies, John remained deeply involved in his work, using it as a coping mechanism to deal with the personal crises he faced. Little did he know that even bigger controversies and challenges awaited him in the future. In 1871, John recognized a golden opportunity to collaborate with one of the leading financiers in the country, Anthony Drexel, and together, they founded the Drexel, Morgan & Company, a private merchant banking house. Later, the firm was renamed simply J.P. Morgan & Company. This would become the firm John managed for the rest of his life, laying the groundwork for the modern banking giant we now know as J.P. Morgan Chase. During the early stages of his career, John primarily acted as a facilitator, connecting wealthy investors and visionaries, earning profits through these deals. However, as his personal fortune and reputation grew, he gained the capacity to finance numerous projects independently. Notably, John's first major investment focus was on the American railroad system. While other major industries were dominated by single magnates like Carnegie and Steel and Rockefeller in oil, the railroad industry presented a different landscape. Numerous competing companies offered similar routes, leading to price wars in their attempts to attract customers. John, with his unique perspective, saw potential in consolidation rather than fierce competition. He believed that merging railroads together would be more advantageous, recognizing the benefits of economies of scale that could be achieved through larger and unified conglomerates. With this vision, John aimed to turn multiple smaller companies into a single, powerful entity. The strategy of consolidation that John implemented in the railroad industry proved remarkably successful. Instead of competing against one another and engaging in price wars, the merged railroads could now set prices as they collectively owned the nearby railway lines. Investing heavily in multiple railroads, John initiated a process of streamlining their management and operations, merging smaller companies into a dominant player capable of outcompeting any remaining rivals. This tactic, aptly named Morganization after John, became synonymous with his approach. What set John apart from other businessmen and investors of his time was his active involvement in the corporate management of these companies. He craved control and took a hands-on approach, leveraging his influential position on the boards of directors to steer the companies as he saw fit. He reshuffled leadership positions within various railway companies to suit his preferences and assembled them into monopolies, with himself at the helm. When railroads sought his help, he would demand full control before offering his assistance. This not only satisfied John's thirst for power but also brought stability to the industry, attracting even more investments, particularly from Europe. As a result, money flowed into U.S. railway companies, viewing them as more consolidated and stable thanks to John's efforts, which further enriched him. John's ambitions knew no bounds. He continually sought to surpass his previous achievements and expand his influence. For instance, he acquired 250,000 shares of stock from William Vanderbilt's New York Central Railroad, one of the most prominent railways in the country. The following year, he executed the largest transaction in U.S. railroad bonds, underwriting the sale of $40 million in bonds to finance the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad. John's acquisitions eventually led to him owning one-third of all railways in America at a time when 60% of the country's stock market capitalization was tied to railroad companies. Thus, John had transcended being merely a wealthy financier. He had become a dominant force in shaping the nation's railway industry. John's involvement in shaping and consolidating railroad conglomerates significantly expanded his power and wealth, further solidifying his reputation as a formidable industry titan. However, his intimidating appearance added to his commanding presence. John suffered from rosacea, a skin condition that inflamed and ruptured blood vessels in his nose, resulting in a disfigured and reddened appearance. Additionally, rhinophima caused his nose to be larger and covered in pimples, making him self-conscious about his looks. When portraits were taken of him, he would request retouching to make his nose appear more normal, which is why it may not be as noticeable in some pictures. Combining his startling facial features with his towering height and forceful manner of speaking, John presented an intimidating demeanor. In 1901, John faced a formidable opponent in President Theodore Roosevelt. John had just consolidated his Northern Pacific Railroad with two other railways, forming the massive Northern Securities Corporation, benefiting from his close relationship with then-President William McKinley. However, when McKinley was assassinated, Roosevelt, with a different perspective on monopolistic practices, took a strong stance against John's actions. Roosevelt ordered the Justice Department to file a lawsuit against the company for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Although John fought the case in court, the company was ultimately broken up. This marked the beginning of a tense relationship between John and Roosevelt. John even expressed his animosity, once remarking that he hoped the first lion Roosevelt encountered in Africa would do his duty. Despite this setback, John remained undeterred and continued to plan ambitious ventures. During Carnegie Steel's peak dominance of the steel industry, Andrew Carnegie, the owner, decided to retire and sell his company. John played a pivotal role in this historic transaction. He encouraged Carnegie to name his price, and despite it being an astonishing $480 million, which would become the largest business deal in history, John agreed on the spot. In fact, he admitted he would have paid even more for the acquisition. In 1901, John finalized the landmark purchase and proceeded with his ambitious plan. He merged Carnegie Steel with Federal Steel Company and several other businesses to form U.S. Steel, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, with a market capitalization of $1.4 billion. To put this in perspective, all manufacturing in the country combined was capitalized at $9 billion. This deal granted John control over approximately two-thirds of American steel production, cementing his dominance in two of the largest industries of the time, steel and railroads. John's influence extended beyond the steel industry. He provided financial support for Thomas Edison's early experiments with electricity and played a key role in merging Edison Electric with its competitors, leading to the creation of General Electric. John's exceptional talent for combining companies and transforming them into unstoppable giants was unrivaled. Despite his remarkable success, a crisis was on the horizon, and John would soon face significant challenges. In 1893, the United States experienced a severe depression, unlike anything it had seen before. After decades of unchecked growth and investments, the bubble burst, plunging the American economy into chaos. Stocks plummeted, losing nearly half of their value, and numerous businesses closed permanently. Hundreds of banks went bankrupt, leading to skyrocketing unemployment rates nationwide. Foreign investors were frightened off and cashed in their American bonds for gold, gradually depleting the U.S. reserves. During this period, the dollar was still tied to the gold standard, allowing anyone to convert paper money into physical gold, instilling more confidence in the currency's value. Normally, the American government maintained at least $100 million worth of gold bullion to back the dollar. However, by 1895, most of that gold had been depleted, and the dollar's value sharply declined. At its lowest, the government had only $9 million worth of gold reserves, leaving it at risk of defaulting on its loans at any moment. This further triggered panic among investors, causing a domino effect where more people withdrew their money from the U.S., depleting the reserves even further. At the time, the U.S. lacked a central bank that could intervene to rescue the situation. President Cleveland understood that this was a critical moment for America, and the country's trajectory would be forever altered. The conventional approach of selling more bonds to the American people wouldn't work quickly enough to address the crisis. John knew that drastic and immediate action was required. He traveled to Washington to meet with the president and presented his game plan to pull America back from the brink of economic disaster. John devised an audacious scheme to form a private syndicate comprising the most prominent bankers in the country. Their objective was to work with foreign investors to bolster America's gold reserves. The syndicate offered to purchase $65 million worth of 30-year gold bonds using 3.5 million ounces of gold. Thanks to an old Civil War statute, President Cleveland could immediately approve the deal without waiting for Congress's approval. Once President Cleveland signed the agreement, John swiftly instructed his associates in New York to act. Within a mere 22 minutes, they secured all the gold bonds. John's decisive actions had an immediate calming effect on the volatile financial market, restoring faith in the economy. His bold move almost single-handedly averted total collapse, while also generating a substantial profit for himself by securing favorable rates on the purchased gold bonds. Although John's intervention saved the day and bailed out the government, it also sparked concerns regarding the immense influence and power one banker could wield over the entire U.S. economy. Some questioned the motives behind his actions, pondering whether they were genuinely patriotic or merely opportunistic to enrich himself. This episode was not the only instance where John played a pivotal role in stabilizing the American economy. His remarkable ability to navigate critical financial situations and influence economic outcomes would prove to be instrumental in multiple instances. In 1907, the United States faced yet another severe financial crisis, causing numerous banks to teeter on the brink of bankruptcy. People lined up in droves to withdraw their money from their accounts, leading the government to instruct bank tellers to count cash slower in an attempt to curb the rate of withdrawals, fearing a catastrophic outcome if a full-fledged bank run occurred. President Roosevelt, despite his disagreements with John on many issues, acknowledged the gravity of the situation and agreed that collaboration between the government and big business was necessary to prevent a depression. Roosevelt called upon J.P. Morgan to step in and rescue the country once again. John's strategy involved significant spending where it was most needed. He gathered the leading financiers and bank executives in his private library on Madison Avenue to devise a plan. The goal was to invest in struggling banks, providing them with substantial sums to pay their depositors and avert bankruptcy. Although some banks would still fail, others could be saved. During the negotiations, John demonstrated his influential presence by locking the doors until an agreement was reached among the bankers. By morning, they all agreed to John's plan, which also received Roosevelt's approval. The U.S. Treasury contributed $25 million to the effort, reflecting the level of trust the president placed in John's business acumen. Remarkably, at the age of 70 and despite suffering from a severe cold, John negotiated this critical rescue operation. He was constantly coughing and sneezing while working to save the U.S. economy. His plan proved successful, injecting much-needed capital back into the economy and restoring public confidence in the banking system. Thanks to John's adept wheelings and dealings, another economic disaster was averted, and he was briefly hailed as a hero. However, this crisis also highlighted how much the nation had become reliant on one individual. People began to realize the dangers of such dependence on a single man. Changes were needed to ensure the stability and resilience of the country's financial system moving forward. As the age of the uncontrolled robber baron drew to a close, John faced increasing scrutiny. The American public grew wary of a handful of businessmen wielding immense power and influence without checks. Summoned to testify before the Pujo Committee, John was at the forefront of their investigation into the extent of Wall Street's money trust and its impact on the American economy. Despite his financial success, John's mental state began to deteriorate, experiencing multiple nervous breakdowns and struggling to cope with the negative portrayal of him in the media. Ironically, John was scheduled to board the Titanic for its maiden voyage but cancelled at the last moment due to health issues. The Pujo Committee's hearings set the stage for the establishment of the Federal Reserve, recognizing the need for a more comprehensive and structured approach to managing the economy, rather than relying solely on a few ultra-rich and powerful individuals. Sadly, John did not live to witness the consequences of the investigation. On March 31, 1913, the 75-year-old financier passed away while on vacation in Rome. His son took over the business and continued its expansion. Over the years, the bank underwent numerous acquisitions and mergers, a trend that John himself would have taken pride in. One of the most significant mergers took place in the year 2000 when J.P. Morgan merged with Chase Bank to form J.P. Morgan Chase, amassing an estimated $3 trillion in assets. Today, after 2 centuries of consolidation in the banking industry, J.P. Morgan Chase stands as the largest bank in the world by market capitalization. Opinions about John Pierpont Morgan may remain divided, but there is no doubt that his legacy continues to shape the world of finance.